Gideon was an Israelite who loved God. And during the time that Gideon was a young man, the nation of Israel was going through a very hard time. The Midianites were mighty warriors, and these were people that lived in the land, and they decided to take over the area where Israel was. And they would just help themselves to whatever crops the Israelites were growing and whatever livestock they had. If they had sheep or cattle, they would just steal them. And the Israelites weren't going to have enough food if that continued. And they struggled and struggled with these wicked people that they were living around. And for 7 years, the Midianites had destroyed the crops and stolen the people's farm animals. And they were frightened, and many had to leave their homes even. They were forced to hide in the mountains and living in caves and in dens. And they were afraid to fight because these Midianites were really, really strong. And the Israelites lost everything, and their only hope was a miracle from God. And the people prayed, and they said, Lord, they finally asked God to help them and to help them drive these Midianites out of Israel. Do you think God heard their prayers? I wonder why they waited for 7 years to finally pray and ask God for help. Because God does promise to help. And sometimes when we go through troubles, it's because there is sin in our life, like we learned about yesterday with Achan, and how they needed to ask God's forgiveness for that sin. But sometimes it's only because we forget to ask him for help. And finally, the Israelites did pray and ask God for help. And then not long after this, a man named Gideon, who, remember, he loved God, he was out threshing the wheat. And our verse this week is about how a wise or a foolish person is like chaff the wind blows away. Well, wheat grows and makes bread. And when you're threshing the wheat, you collect it and you put it in stalks, and you get the wheat part off, and then the chaff blows away. And so he was out threshing this wheat one day, and he was working along, and suddenly he was kind of hiding in a secluded place when suddenly he saw somebody. And of course he was hoping to hide because he didn't want the Midianites to find them. So when he saw somebody, he thought, oh no, who is this? And I'm sure he was afraid. But you know what? It was actually an angel. And the angel came to Gideon with a word from God. And he says, I have a message for you. And he said, God is with you, Gideon. Well, Gideon questioned him. He said, well, if God is with us, why have the Midianites been taking over our land and oppressing us? And why is life so hard? Why hasn't God delivered us from this hardship? And then the angel said, God has chosen you, Gideon, to be the man that will deliver Israel. Remember, God had chosen Moses many years before. The next choice that God has chosen was Gideon. Can you imagine how surprised Gideon would be at hearing this message from him, from the angel? And then he said, well, who am I to deliver Israel? My family is poor, and I'm just a common man. He wasn't anything special. Kind of like Moses. Right? Moses wasn't really anything special either. He was a shepherd. But God had chosen Gideon, who wasn't anything special really, but he had a heart for God. And the angel said, the Lord will be with you, and you will smite the Midianites. And then Gideon said to the angel, please wait while I prepare a meal for you. So Gideon went, and he went home, and he got the things that he could start a meal. And so he set up a fire, and he brought some food. Let's see, actually he brought the food. And then the angel took his staff and touched the food, and it caught on fire, and it was all consumed by fire. It's kind of like a miracle. And then suddenly the angel disappeared. Just as quickly as he came, the angel disappeared. That was quite an amazing sight. And maybe was that enough for Gideon to believe what the angels came to say? Well, that day he built an altar, and to remember this place and to remember this special time that God had spoken to him. And then he spent the rest of the day praying and seeking God. But later that night, the Lord spoke to Gideon. He said, Gideon, your father has some altars that were built to heathen gods. You're to take 2 of your father's oxen and pull those altars down, and then take the oxen and sacrifice them to me. That's a big task. He had to go to his father and push down these huge altars that were for other gods. Remember, the Bible said, there shall be no other gods before me. And then take the oxen used to push those big altars down and sacrifice them. That took 10 servants. Gideon found 10 helpers to help him do this task, but he did it. He obeyed God. And then the next day, Gideon started to assemble an army, and he sent messengers all over Israel asking for the young men to join the army. And before long, a very large group gathered together to become the army for Gideon. But Gideon wanted to be absolutely sure he was doing God's work exactly the way God wanted him to. He was one that liked to obey God all the way. But he wanted a different sign. He wanted to know that he was doing the right thing. So he asked God for a sign. So one day he said, God, if this truly is you telling me that we are going to win this battle, would you please give me a sign? And he said, I would like the sign to be, I'm going to put out a piece of cloth on the ground outside my house. And in the morning, when I come out, I want to check that cloth. And if the ground all around is wet, but the cloth is dry, then I'll know it was you. I'll know it would be a miracle, and God would be with him. So the next morning, when Gideon went out, he put this piece of cloth in the grass, and he went out and he grabbed that cloth and he squeezed it out, and the ground was all wet all around. The grass was completely wet with dew. You know what dew is. In the morning, the grass might be, it maybe didn't rain in the night, but because of the temperature change, there's this water that's all over the grass. The grass was completely wet, but that fleece was completely dry. Not a drop of water had collected in that fleece. But he wanted to be absolutely sure. And he wasn't completely satisfied, so he prayed again. And he said, God, please don't be angry with me, but I have one more request so that I may know that what I am doing is your will. Tonight, I'm going to put that wool cloth out, and in the morning, if the ground is dry, but the fleece is wet, I'll know that this is what you have called me to do. So the next day, the ground was completely dry, but his fleece was wet. He squeezed it out, and it was completely full of water. So he knew that God was going to be with him, and that he had chosen him to lead his army against the Midianites. We can also ask God to lead our lives as he did in Gideon's life. Oftentimes I pray and I say, Lord, what do you want me to do? Help me know what to do. And I'll ask him. I'll maybe even say something specific, like, if this happens, then I know this is what you want me to do. Many times in my life, God has opened and closed doors that way. Lord, if it's your will that we buy this house, please let the bank approve it, or different things like that. So I pray about things, and then God opens the doors and shows me his will. And that's what happened with Gideon. He put that fleece out. Putting a request out for God is like putting that lamb's wool in the grass. And did it collect water or not? And so Gideon sought God, he prayed, and he believed God. And we'll find out tomorrow what happens next in our Bible story about Gideon, and are they going to be able to fight against the Midianites?